So today I'd like to talk about a very interesting work that if you're going to do any sort of classes in post-colonial studies, you'll probably have to run into this work, and that is Edward Said's Orientalism. This is a really seminal text, and it has a lot of stuff going on in it that I think lays the groundwork for really any lay person to understand exactly what he's getting at. And it treads on ground that is both historical and political and philosophical and literary in kind of a way that shows how they're all interconnected. In a way, Said, and he pays respect to this in the book, but he takes a lot of ideas from Foucault, namely that the knowledge that we reach is intimately tied up in the power relations that allowed that knowledge to come through. And Said is troubled by the fact that we seem to have a problem dealing with other cultures, and it's quite easy to see that. And Said is struggling with an academic discipline that is Orientalism, and we'll lay out exactly what he means by all of his vocabulary, but he sees within the Orientalist discourse, and the word discourse is quite important there, a very negative way of thinking about others, and this can extend beyond just talking about the Orient. And I'm going to refer to the Orient throughout here, even though that's not necessarily politically correct. I'm just using that because that's his vocabulary, and this is, of course, here to help you get guided through Orientalism. Now, the whole work is based around two groups. We have Occidental and Oriental. And these two are separated by a very big line. And it's been taken for granted for a long time that there's a significant difference here. And throughout this work, and I think it's actually important to read the preface to this 25th anniversary edition, is kind of the one that you'll see pretty commonly, and it's got the preface and stuff from I think like 1994, which is like 20 years after, or 25 years after it was written or something like that. And he basically lays out his approach, and he's not necessarily going for a historical development of the whole field, but rather he wants to show how the field of Orientalism is able to change a significant amount such that from generation to generation it changes quite substantially, and that makes for why it's so hard to get rid of or to move past, because it utilizes a lot of mechanisms that make it difficult to spot. But he basically wants to lay out how there's kind of three large periods of Orientalism, which is basically the study of this. So Orientalism is a number of things, but importantly, it is academic. And this has a lot of implications. We like to think of what it means to be a modern academic, to be a lecturer and do research and stuff like that. And throughout the work, Said is talking about the different ways in which the Oriental has been dealt with, and that the Oriental meaning the individual person, but also the large category. Because an important part of what Said's project is about is that from this split is taken the Oriental with a capital T and a capital O. And this is both universal and particular. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that, in a sense, this entire discourse of talking about the Orient, which kind of means the East, and the Occidental, the West, there is some kind of divide, or at least if it doesn't actually exist, has been implicitly recognized by decades of scholarship that says that there's some big difference here. And when the Orientalist starts to talk about the Oriental, they're simultaneously doing two things. They're talking about the Oriental as a universal category in the sense that there are Oriental nations like you've got, I don't know, Iran and Saudi Arabia and China and so on and so on. And Said is particularly interested in the Orient as it talks about the Near East, because there's kind of different understandings of what it means to be an Easterner. Obviously, you know, when we talk about the East versus the West, it assumes we have some sort of central reference point from which we can decide what's north, east, south, and west. And in a sense, it's a properly totalitarian tendency intellectually, and Said is very keen on that, which is that it presupposes we have some sort of starting point by which all other culture can be understood. And he sees this as very damaging, especially when we get into the Oriental, because it represents some universal category of Easternness that has something that sets it apart from the West. But it also is able to stand for every particular instance of an Oriental. And what I mean by that is that Said talks a lot about pilgrimages going to the East and how, you know, we had people like Alexander the Great or other kind of conquerors who came to the East and tried to understand it, but in a way that was almost destructive. It was understanding in order to destroy the culture itself by undermining it and showing how it's fundamentally irrational. So, in a way, the talk of the Oriental, which is most importantly utilized in the academic setting, allows for us to talk about every single person individually and lump every individual instance of running into an actual person from Saudi Arabia or from Iraq or something like that, and also talk about it as a universal category, that all of the Middle East is such and such a way, or all of Indochina is such and such a way, or, you know, all of the Indian subcontinent is such and such a way. So it's very damaging, and, you know, it's pretty easy for us to see nowadays. I mean, this idea of the Oriental, we can see today if we talk about the black or the blacks, which I would never do. I'm just doing it here for reference, is obviously racially charged. It's based on stereotypes, and most importantly, it's based on some unfounded hegemony among this category, that all black people are such and such a way, which has gradually been deconstructed over the generations, but sadly still exists. And we could say that you know, the racism that comes from this is indicative of academic discourse of the Oriental like this. So the academic part of Orientalism allows this to take on a greater significance, because not only is it academic, but it serves as a library and, in a sense, becomes something retroactive, that when future Orientalists want to talk about the East, they refer back to the works of other Orientalists who talk about all sorts of strange aspects of the Orient that we can clearly see are, at the very least, oversimplifications, if not just overtly racist, talking about Oriental despotism or this kind of lack of rationality, which is a super important thing that Said talks about, which is that we build up this library of giving previous academics with very narrow-minded understandings of other cultures legitimacy by making it where to be an academic is to refer to these thinkers in such and such a way. Now, Said is met with an important question, which he talks about very late in the book. I think it's like page 325, which is like 2 or 3 pages from the end, which is, how do we represent other cultures? And Said is concerned about this because, in a sense, all this Orientalism, which is basically a survey of this whole field, but from the perspective of the Westerner, is that it represents an impulse to otherize. That's what I call it, and I'm sure other people have talked about that before, but this is the way I like to think about Orientalism, is it's a way of talking about the other in an active way. Because if we look at the word otherize, it has this I-Z-E, which is to make. And, if you think about to synthesize is to turn something into a group, to mold it and shape it and change it. And Said is critically aware that to be an Orientalist is not to talk about the Orient in some laid-back kind of fashion, but rather, and very importantly, is to speak for the Orient. And this idea of speech we can read into a lot, but importantly, it's a way of dealing with other cultures, and we get a wide variety of ways that he is utilizing sources from across history, of various scholars who either view the East as something magical and something to be understood for its ancient beauty, but in sort of a patronizing way, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But conversely, it can be in a way to imperialize, to take something over and to short circuit all of its vicissitudes, as Baudrillard says. And it's a totalizing discourse, which is that we have some person here, and this is the Westerner. And over here, we have the Oriental. And we might call this the Easterner today. I don't know why I chose to bifurcate this vocabulary like this. But the Westerner is faced with a number of things. The Westerner is in a position of power, and this is for a number of historic reasons, but it's clear to see that, for example, resources or development of a country has a lot to do with its power. And of course, this is why, and Said talks about this later in the book, but the recent success of the Middle East can be directly linked to the finding of oil, and thus Orientalism extends a sort of capitalist impulse to consume and control and dominate an entire field, which is what Orientalism does. It's a field that is pre-made to be dominated by the Westerner. And the Westerner is here sat looking at the Oriental and is met with a problem of identity, which we can talk about in a very philosophical way. Said kind of shies away from talking about this in an extremely rigorous sense. It's more literary and historical, which I have no problem with. But especially for my interests in philosophy, you will have known that, for example, if you watch my video on the master-slave dialectic, or Heidegger's Das Mann, or Heidegger on death, that the confronting of an other has a lot to do with our personal identity. If the Westerner was here alone without the Oriental, he has nothing to set him apart as a person that gives him identity. For example, if he is, I don't know, tall, this doesn't really mean anything. It's just some sort of abstract property, like the fact that he has phalanges. But if he looks upon the Oriental, and the Oriental is short, which you can see just in my writing that I'm almost implicitly continuing on a stereotype that Easterners are shorter than us Westerners or something like that, which might have to say a lot to do, which might have a lot to say about the fact that this discourse is so pervasive and why Said felt Orientalism such an important work to write. But now that there is some difference that has been established, in a sense, the Westerner is able to prop himself up as having some identity and having some sureness that he is not exactly like everything else. Because if everything is exactly like everything, we run into a number of problems. For example, if I have this board with nothing on it, and I choose any point, and I want to talk about this point, and this is kind of analogizing the board to all of reality. If I want to talk about any one point on the board, it is completely undifferentiated from every other point. And thus, it has no identity in the sense that if I want to talk about the point, I can't talk about it in any way that wouldn't simultaneously implicate every other point on the board. This would be like if everyone is exactly identical, then nobody's really special. Or this is kind of like in The Incredibles. If everybody is super, we've got supers everywhere. This is superheroes. If everyone is super, then no one is super. And the main villain uses that for some pretty interesting monologue kind of in the middle of the movie. But the important part is that if everything is unitary, nothing has identity. So difference is a very important part of our equation of having identity for each of these individuals. And identity is very important for us not only personally, but politically. It allows us to create countries that have shared identities as a culture and as a people. But when we go into this situation and we look at the situation as simply some person who's tall and some person is short, there's no inherent power imbalance here. In fact, this difference is beneficial for both of these persons, because the Westerner, who, I mean, really, we could erase Westerner right now and just give him like Steve, and this guy's name is Mark. I mean, Steve is tall and Mark is short. And barring any sort of cultural shunning of shortness or tallness, both of these people have a stronger identity because of this difference. And this difference works to make them both better people. But the problem is, what if they are already in a position of domination and servitude? Think of this as if I have some sort of hierarchy. And up top, I have my Westerner. And all the way at the bottom, we have our Oriental, our Easterner. Now, the question is, what exactly is this hierarchy? What is making the Westerner greater than the Easterner, or making the Occidental greater than the Oriental? And this is the historical project that Said wishes to examine and uproot. The fact that throughout time, there have been scholars who have used all sorts of insults and ways of understanding other cultures in a way to undermine them, and in a way to turn them into a static entity, which we'll talk about later because I think that's also very important. But implicit in one's understanding of identity, especially if there is already, whether or not this hierarchy actually exists, if there is some sort of perceived difference in power, the person on the top will have implicitly in their identity an attitude towards those who do not have such an identity, namely to otherize. The Westerner otherizes the Easterner in a way that tries to do away with any of their commonalities. Because if we imagine the Westerner and the Oriental realize that they both like dates, the Westerner might be like, oh no, that's a Muslim thing, and those Muslims are, this is kind of interesting, but there's several historians and anthropologists and sociologists and philologists throughout Orientalism that basically say inherent in the language of Arabic is violence and a impulse towards that kind of totalitarian threatening of other peoples. And in a sense, we can see how that is a way to manufacture hostility in the lower rungs, and not only otherize them by making them different fundamentally in their human character, but also to justify the Westerners being on top. This position has to be maintained at the complete expense of this Oriental. Now the problem is, if this Oriental doesn't exist anymore, well, the Westerner has no one else on the hierarchy. I mean, we might as well just get rid of the bottom levels of the hierarchy and just have a flat plane, because there's nothing below here to give the Westerner any sort of sense that he is superior anymore. So the Oriental must be retained, but in a very important way. And the retaining of the Oriental happens in a paradoxical manner that is, as Said rightly points out, devastating to both, really the entirety of everyone's identity on the planet. Now, I mentioned earlier that Said is key to point out that the modus operandi of the Orientalist and Orientalism as a discourse, as a way of understanding and as a way of reaching knowledge, is to understand the Oriental in a way in which they speak for the Oriental. Because if we think about, we want to understand cultures, and that's what we've been talking about this whole time. We have some country here with a culture, and we have some country here with a culture. We have country A and B. And if we want to know what country A is saying, we might find some kind of writing that has been made. And we might hear from the horse's mouth, what does country A have to say for themselves? What kind of image do they construe of themselves? And for country B, we might want to do the same thing. Maybe we want to go and there's some person and they're doing a speech of some kind. And we go and listen to the speech and we hear what they have to say. Now, this is all well and good, and when we analyze it in this abstract way, like we did before, where there's no power imbalance, there's no problem with there being dialogue that goes both ways, and hearing and understanding and speaking that goes both ways. Now, the problem happens when there is this sort of idealization of oneself, of taking what one has to some sort of divine status that, I don't know, this is something that came from God or something like this. I don't know, we might think of this as the Bible or something like this. I mean, it could be anything. It could be the US Constitution. It could be some manifesto of some political leader. It could be anything. You don't have to think of this as a religiously charged thing. We can think of this in abstract terms. But when one wants to elevate their own culture, which is a typical impulse within one's culture, is to be proud of what one has. And if one is not proud of what one has, that typically tends to create a culture that tends to fall apart. And when one idealizes one's own culture, and one sees that there is another culture out there, there is an implicit desire to make this look as best as possible. This is obvious. When we talk about our own ideas, we want them to be as airtight as possible. But when it comes time to extend that hand to another culture, our implicit desire is to look at this culture and put blinders on. This doesn't mean we ignore the culture. That was what had been done for a long time, simply because of a lack of streamlining of communication. It was hard for countries to talk to each other, and we can understand why there was misunderstandings between the cultures. Even if built into that understanding, as little as it may be, people were just throwing around stereotypes. It's like, okay, yeah, they didn't know any better. We can use that sort of excuse. But when this communication becomes possible, and here this is listening, there is a tendency to use what one already has as knowledge as a precondition to alter what one hears. One starts listening to this speech and has certain ideas about what they already think. And especially if it's something different, it's easy to take from this speech and add lots of qualifiers that might not necessarily be wrong, but might be, for example, a misrepresentation. So maybe there's some kind of speech and all you hear is violence and oppression or idiocy. All of these things could be possible ways of confronting something different. And these countries are different. They have different geographies and different cultural makeups. But And this is coming from the kind of neoliberal, or not neoliberal, but the classical liberal understanding that we are all endowed with these basic inalienable rights. You know, we like to think that all men are created equal. I mean, think about the founding documents of the US talking about all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This becomes very paradoxical when the Orientalist, who is the same kind of person that would have written the Constitution, starts trying to listen to other cultures. And as a way to prop up their culture, and maybe even to prop up their document that says that these rights extend to all people, and there is manufactured hostility on the part of the other. We create, out of what we want to hear with our own ears, a number of obviously biased understandings of the speech. And this is inherent to any hearing of anything really, or any seeing or any reading, is that there are certain violences that come along with trying to understand something. And in a broad sense, we can see this as a problem of learning and knowledge itself, which is that when listening happens, we tend to disenfranchise the other. And as such, we gain selective hearing and we hear what we want to hear. And as a result, maybe the speech was about resistance to oppression or something like this. And this resistance, maybe we don't understand their position, and as such, we see it as dangerous, revolutionary behavior that is undermining the founding principles of society, which is kind of ironic, especially coming from like the American perspective, where our country was kind of founded on a very overt revolution. But that's neither here nor there. Even if this is what's actually being said, and this is the great difficulty that we see, which I think Said is keen on, is that, what does it really mean to hear what someone has to say? I mean, always we have ideological blinders that are controlling what we hear. And in a sense, Said is asking how we can mitigate this, because there are conscious processes that go behind this. We can try to reel in our biases and try and be as objective as possible. But this comes with a number of problems when we make the Orient speak from our perspective. We make the Orient speak. And as a result, this becomes very negative when we turn this into an academic discipline. We've got our school here, and the university, as far as Said is concerned, has been a very important part, kind of as we talked about before, in reinforcing these views, because from this, our only channel of understanding the Orient becomes our own glasses and our own ways of talking about other cultures, which, especially in a sparse age where there are comparatively few understandings of the Orient, and this kind of happens with some of the first trips to Egypt or the Levant, for example, there are fairly few scholars who are actually going from the West to the East to talk about it. And they come back with all these experiences. And in a way, the Westerner is struggling with the fact that there are commonalities between them and the East, especially the Levant, the birthplace of the Torah and the Bible and Islam. And there is a very unsettling fact, which is that, and this is a bad drawing of, but this is, this is Israel and whatnot. This is the birthplace of Judaism and Christianity and Islam. And considering that the Occident is virtually a Christian, well, I mean, it's called Christendom sometimes. That is the way it is grown to be talked about in many of these cultures. Christendom, it's inherent in the culture that it is linked to Christianity. And as such, the Christian is in a very particular bind, which is that Islam is unknown. It has a barrier formed around it. And this is for obvious reasons. We don't understand it. They live thousands of miles away and have had very little contact with us other than very brief, take the Ottoman Empire and the Islamic Caliphate's interaction with the West. It was very brief, but very terrifying, but a very limited experience of what it means to be a part of the East. In essence, the exigence of all this was a violent impulse that went on to be generalized to represent all of the East. So this wall of, really just not understanding creates an opportunity for the Christian, because here this is Christianity, the Christian can interpret this wall however they want. And what they can do is they can do the same thing where they manufacture dissent. And because they've manufactured dissent, they can create a distance between them and Islam that might not exist otherwise, because they have so many commonalities. And of course they have their own particularities that set them apart, but they are all Abrahamic faiths. And as such, the identification with Abraham creates a problematic, which is that all of a sudden the powerful position above all of the East, which the Westerner maintains and has tried to maintain for hundreds of years, becomes a bit tenuous. And as a result, there is manufactured dissent that happens as a result of the current case of not understanding and wanting to move towards understanding. But with this understanding comes, as we've shown, an inherent spinning down of the process. It's like playing a game of telephone, and you should understand, especially like say you're doing an academic study of telephone, or maybe you're even not, and this is the first time you've seen the game of telephone. You see maybe just the final message, and you might be like, oh, I have no reason to doubt these people. I think they're probably telling accurately what was said at the beginning. Or maybe you think they have perfect hearing or something like this, and you assume that the final product is what has been there from the beginning, and you completely ignore all the interpretive steps along the way. And imagine the kind of things that influence, it's almost impossible to talk about with real specificity, but what influences the way someone understands something. Maybe it's a bunch of children playing telephone, and they're talking about a building when they first start playing telephone. But it's lunchtime and everyone is really hungry. So somehow the message evolves into something about It goes from building to chilled greens. Now they're talking about food. And there are all sorts of biases that go about creating the image. And some of these are, just kind of bound to happen. But understandingly, especially if let's say the child at the beginning has some superiority complex, they might make a really hard message or something that they know will be interpreted in such a way. Maybe they'll say it super fast and say it in a way where they slur their words together that's intentionally going to make all the other classmates look bad. That's pretty analogous to the Western situation, because the Westerner has something to gain in this. And if they can, they will. And in the same situation in telephone, because the child has something to gain, although it might be very minute, and this might be the limits of the analogy, but they will gain something if they will. So as a result, understanding becomes something that is inherently entropic. And what are we going to make out of this? Now, Said makes very clear that this is not some sort of utopian project to figure out the true Oriental. Because the way we've talked about the Oriental, and maybe it might be useful to go into some detail, but the way the Oriental is constructed, it is impossible. So let's look at what it is to be the Oriental. This is pretty easy to think about if we think about, at least for us Americans who have kind of a tragic history with race relations, especially with regards to the Black community and stomping them down. To talk about the Black community for a long time was tied up in a bunch of assumptions. And this has been even supported in philosophy in a very nefarious way. And if you read Deborah K. Heikes's Rationality, Representation, and Race, she goes through this, how the history of philosophy has helped to shape racism by giving it some sort of imperial backing, some way to restrict people from their rational capabilities and uphold power relations. But to be the Oriental is to be lacking in a number of ways. And probably the most important of these is they're lacking in rationality. And what I mean by this is, and if you read Orientalism, I'm kind of trying to shy away from quotes to do a little bit of a different style, but I can go more into depth if that would be helpful. But lots of writers whom he criticizes in the book talk about the fact that the Easterner or the Oriental or the Semite or the Semite is inherently incapable of the same rationality or any rationality at all that the Westerner is capable of achieving. That they cannot have peace because they can't have rationality. And of course, why can't they have peace? That is partially because there has been a violent narrative constructed about the Oriental that justifies us saying they aren't at peace, and thus we can create an explanation that we want for why they aren't at peace that is itself predicated on a baseless presupposition of Orientalism itself. So they have no rationality, and they can't make advanced governments, and they can't cooperate because they essentially operate based off of whims. And this is actually kind of an interesting one that I heard in a review to the book before I had actually gotten it. And it was all about Bernard Lewis's talks about certain things in Arabic and about the tendencies of the Arab. for Bernard Lewis, he does this short understanding of a word in Arabic, which is in Roman letters is thawra, which is usually translated as revolution. And implicit in an Orientalist understanding of thawra, as we have kind of talked about before, it's going to tend to otherize a culture. Even if there's not necessarily ill intent going into the report, I think for Bernard Lewis, he kind of makes a compelling reason why we ought to think that. But on thawra, he has a number of things to say. Quoting Lewis here, in the Arabic-speaking countries, a different word was used for revolution, thawra. The root thawara in classical Arabic meant to rise up, for example, of a camel, to be stirred or excited, and hence, especially in Maghribi usage, to rebel. It is often used in the context of establishing a petty, independent sovereignty. Thus, for example, the so-called party kings who ruled in 11th century Spain after the breakup of the Caliphate of Cordoba are called thuar, singular da'ir. The noun thawra at first means excitement, as in the phrase cited in the Sihah, a standard medieval Arabic dictionary, and it's a long phrase that I won't say. Wait till this excitement dies down, is the translation. A very apt recommendation. The verb is used by al-Iji in the form of thawaran, or itharat fitna, stirring up sedition, as one of the dangers which should discourage a man from practicing the duty of resistance to bad government. Thawra is the term used by Arabic writers in the 19th century for the French Revolution and by their successors for the approved revolutions, domestic and foreign, of our own time. And Said is very critical here because he says, what is the point of, when talking about the word thawra and saying that it is to rise up, using to rise up of a camel, like a camel rises up? It might seem fairly minute, and that was the criticism that was levied in this review in Amazon, was that Said was reading in too much into these people. He was making them look bad on purpose. And it might seem like that on first glance, but it is clear that, and Lewis, if you read this last section of the book, it's like page 300 to the end, he is talking about this inherent bias that Lewis has to Islam and to try to disregard it as some sort of petty movement. And that's clearly what's happening here with the understanding of thawra, of revolution, that it's a petty, independent sovereignty, and it's some sort of, it's like a sovereign citizen kind of thing of, oh, the law just doesn't apply to me, I'm going to make some sort of little government of whatever I want. And clearly, there has been an academic discourse that has been built up in which we use philology, or kind of the understanding of the development of words, to bake a definition into revolution that we will then justify with experiences that have been given by past Orientalists who themselves have put in their biases into their interpretations of what has happened in the Arabic world, for example, like we talked about in the speech. So there is an inherent looking down upon the Orient that happens when one does philological studies or anthropological studies or any other academic study that tries to reduce the entirety of the Orient, because the Oriental here is a offshoot of Oriental, or the Orient, which we have to remember. The Orient is a huge expanse of territory. The Orient is covering Northern Africa, it's talking about Middle East, especially the Levant. It's talking about, Asia as a whole. So this could be anywhere from any of your stands, your Turkmenistan, your Uzbekistan, your Kazakhstan. This could be talking about India or Pakistan. This could be talking about China, Japan, Korea, etc., etc. This is like half of the frickin' world that is being lumped under the singular of the Orient. This isn't Orient's. No, it's Orient in the singular. And the problem happens when we try to turn this wide diaspora into a single word. And what happens when we do that, in addition to using all these academic studies to try to discount their rationality, but the Oriental is static. It is important that any sort of heterogeneity within the Orient is done away with, because the Occident wants to do the best it can to make itself as big as possible and make the Orient as small as possible, in kind of a cellular way, to almost open up and receive it inside of itself and understand it and utilize it only from within its cell wall of sorts. So the Orient has to become static, and we see this exactly playing out in the example just cited from Bernard Lewis, which is that revolution, which is in a sense a very obvious discussion of change, of big change, and potentially change that is going to actually influence the West in significant ways, that is going to undermine their sovereignty. We can think about this today with, for example, Saudi oil companies. They are of important and critical interest to the US, and as a result, there is all sorts of conspiracies of, oh, the Saudis are going to do this and this and this, and maybe that's right, or maybe Israel is going to do this and this and this, or it might be better to talk about Palestine, of making Palestine some sort of aggressor, that, oh, they're fomenting this evil plan to overthrow us. Or, I mean, you can think about the anti-Semitic tendencies in the 30s through the 50s, for example, and even extending till today. The Oriental must be made static by getting rid of any tendencies for change in order to make it a suitable thing that can be eaten up. But in addition, and I also briefly kind of mentioned this in passing, which is that it must be understood as unpredictable, as volatile, as insane, maybe. It's an important one. But the Orient must be understood as this subterfuge of just impossibility, because the Orient has to be reduced, all of the territory, to a single abstraction. And, you know, we can see the Orient talks about a whole territory. The Oriental can be used to refer to that entire territory, but not as if it's a territory anymore, but as if it is one person. As if all it needed, it being the Westerner, was one single presupposition or meeting with an Oriental to confirm everything they knew about the Orient. So not only must they become some static category, but within that, the Oriental must simultaneously butt up against its own possibility that has been created by the Occident, namely that they are volatile and impossible to control and completely unwieldy, and as such, they deserve to be taken over. So not only is there all this impossibility, and I mean, with this rationality, this kind of comes to be, in layman's terms, that Orientals are dumb, which is kind of saying the quiet part out loud, which is what is being said by the supposed lack of rationality. It's just calling them dumb in a different font. And as a result, the Oriental has been put in a double bind, in a triple bind of sorts. But an important last category that I'll talk about, and there are plenty more I was going to talk about, but I'm just trying to keep it a little shorter, is that the Orient is ancient, and it is forever ancient. In the sense that whenever an Orientalist does want to observe, maybe out of some sort of impulse to learn, the Orient, they want to go back to some prehistoric idea of the Orient, back when, everyone is riding on stone tablets and everyone's on their camels, which people still ride on camels, but cars are everywhere in the Middle East, if you didn't know that. They must be brought back to the Bible, the Torah, the Bhagavad Gita. The Orient is only understood in a way that makes them, and this is critical, because obviously these are past times, but because of this, the Orient becomes mute. It becomes understood as a person that can never talk back because they're already too far gone. All we know of them is our own Western understanding of them, and because there is a refusal to understand the Orient outside of these sorts of, this is kind of the sub-idea, which is almost patronizing, is a sort of ancient wisdom, I'll do that in quotes, that comes out of the Orient. As a way to struggle with the fact that, for example, the Abrahamic faiths are all under the same roof when they were in their genesis. They all came from Abraham. As a result, the Westerner will appeal to this ancient wisdom, the ancient wisdom of Abraham, when everything was great and God was speaking to people every day and performing miracles, and resurrection was a sort of banality. So this ancient wisdom is referred to in a way which is a very careful slight on the Oriental, namely that they become mute. They are no longer allowed to talk because that wisdom is ancient, it's past, it's gone. And all we have now is chaos that has resulted primarily from when we departed from the ancient and Islam was born. At this juncture between Christianity and Islam, both coming from this ancient wisdom, at this juncture right here is when the Orient becomes completely cut off and becomes impossible to understand. And we can see this in a lot of even 20th century Orientalists still will talk about the entire Levant and the inhabitants therein as Semites, which is not only reductive, but wrong. And that is the modus operandi of Orientalism. It's reductive, but wrong. It reduces a multivariate space to an impossibly narrow-minded term. And as a result, we lose the opportunity to have any chance to learn about cultures. And Said doesn't give us a lot of ways out of this. He says that it is important for the Orient to be able to speak for itself, but he gives us reason for pause, because he says, is there any chance that we can talk about other cultures? Really, all he is able to do is give us a historical understanding of the space that we lie in. He says on page 327, perhaps if we remember that the study of human experience usually has an ethical, to say nothing of a political consequence, in either the best or worst sense, we will not be indifferent to what we do as scholars. He says right above that, no one can escape dealing with, if not the East-West division, then the North-South one, the have-not one, the imperialist, anti-imperialist one, the white-colored one. We cannot get around them all by pretending they do not exist. On the contrary, contemporary Orientalism teaches us a great deal about the intellectual dishonesty of dissembling on that score, the result of which is to intensify the divisions and make them both vicious and permanent. So we see that a historical understanding of Orientalism is very necessary, because we see the sort of impulses that we are driven to when we talk about other cultures. And this gives us a really good starting off point for people like Fanon to go to and talk about, what does real resistance look like? Or what does it really mean for oppressed peoples to speak for themselves? So I hope this has been an interesting video. I really think you should pick up Orientalism. It's about 300 pages, but it reads really quick. I read it about around 3 weeks, and I'm a really slow reader. And I hope this gives you some food for thought in how you can interact with people around you. That's it, and I'll see you in another lecture.